Good afternoon, everybody. It's Wednesday, the 29th of April, and we're doing another telecast over Facebook and later for YouTube. And I'm shifting back now to the week before Easter when I introduced this memoir that I'm working on. We first did the liturgies and continue to do the masses on Sundays. And then I did a two-part lesson last week on the sacraments of weakness, sacraments of anointing and reconciliation. But before Easter, I introduced this memoir that I call The Right Place at the Right Time, Memoir of a Kentucky Priest. I gave an overview of it, told you a lot about how I had developed my ideas for it and what I had in mind to do. Then I read the introduction, which of course overlapped a bit with the overview. I had submitted the overview to Spalding University as part of the application process for their program in creative writing. And then when I took my first piece of creative nonfiction to Spalding to be critiqued and workshopped, I took the introduction to this memoir. So if you tuned in before Easter, I read both of those, both the overview and the introduction. And again, you saw some overlapping there. Well, now I'm beginning with the first of the segments. Remember, there were 10 segments covering periods of history, and this first one is essentially everything before my birth. It's 1633 to 1947, and you're going to realize that when I speak about being a Kentucky priest, then I want to go to a lot of the elements that go into becoming a priest, not the specific things in my case, but all of the general background of my part in the settlement of Kentucky by Catholics and Protestants, people of religious interest. Particularly on my father's side, it's pretty much unbroken back to folks who came from Maryland in the 18th century. And then on my mother's side, folks who came from Virginia in the 18th century, but essentially were Protestant. I'm going to include a lot of that, too, because we're going to see how then in the 20th century, I have a pretty strong ecumenical bent. And so a lot of that background is going to be pertinent. So I begin then with 1633 to 1947, part one. And what I thought was going to perhaps be about 35, 40 pages has gone into, approximately 90 now. I'm up to part five of this 1633 to 1947. And just a hint, a little spoiler, I'm saying about 90 pages and I'm not past the Civil War yet. So anyway, there's a good bit more to go on this. In fact, I can imagine that this could be a volume one of a two-part piece of writing. But anyway, you're going to hear then in the next couple of broadcasts, Right Place at the Right Time, Memoir of a Kentucky Priest, 1633 to 1947, part one. So we're going to be a little while even getting to my birth. That part hasn't been written at all. Again, a little bit of a spoiler. When I was writing all this background, one of my mentors found it a little tedious. She didn't quite understand why I was going into such detail about the 18th, 19th centuries. And in fact, at one point she said, I'd like to see you write something more contemporary, something more that's specific to your life and your experience, and I want you to write about a conflict. So actually I took on two things. One, I talked about some crises that happened before my birth, but to my immediate family. And that was a little short piece, about 8 pages or so. And I shared that here at the parish one weekend. And then the other thing that I did in response to her challenge to write about a conflict is that I took the years 1969 to 1973. Those were the last 4 years of preparation before I was ordained. And I wrote about conflict specifically with my father. And so that's a segment of the post-1947 material that has been written, and I may share that with you at some point before I go back to the writing lab. So here we are, 1633 to 1947, part 1. In the late autumn, early winter of 1633 to 34, a pair of small boats attempted a journey which they fervently hoped and believed would bring them from England to the fledgling colonies of North America. Early in the journey, they encountered a storm, the severity of which would not be seen for another 350 years. The wooden boats, a sloop of approximately 50 feet in length, and a pinnace measuring just over half that size, were respectively known as the Ark and the Dove. You can see pictures of the Ark and the Dove if you come to the office at St. Ambrose. Aboard the Ark, all control of the rudder was lost in this storm, and the mainsail was torn from top to bottom, leaving the craft, quote, at the mercy of the wind and the waves, unquote. Assessing the damage done to other boats of their size and larger, the Ark returned to harbor to make repairs and to mourn the loss of the Dove, of which they had completely lost sight and hope. This migration, the survivors of which would eventually reach present-day Maryland, likely included my genealogical ancestors on my father's side. That they were my spiritual ancestors is an absolute certainty. They were Catholics. As any student of the history of the United States learns, the migrants aboard the Ark and the Dove were preceded by other groups, most notably those who settled in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, and those who came on the Mayflower to Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620. What distinguished the 1633 migration from the others, and what links me to them, as I've already said, is that in their faith tradition, they identified as Roman Catholics. It had been just over 100 years earlier that King Henry VIII had begun the English Reformation in protest to the Church of Rome. The conflict continued painfully with mutual oppression and martyrdom during the reigns of his daughters and other successors until at least the mid-19th century. So these adventurers on board the Ark and the Dove, while by no means unique in their basic response to spiritual promptings, could claim nonetheless validly that they were seeking asylum from religious persecution. There would be more in the colonies. It is from the journal of their spiritual leader, Father Andrew White of the Society of Jesus, that we have much of the information about the Ark and the Dove. He was a member of the Jesuits, and all of those in that order would have exercised religious ministry in clandestine ways. Some, very notably St. Edmund Campion, experienced torture and martyrdom at Tyburn, a conspicuous site near the Marble Arch, present-day popular tourist destination in London. Father White tells of other boats and the damage rendered them by the storm, his intention surely being to illustrate how convinced were those on board the ark about the demise of their relatives and friends aboard the smaller Dove. He gives the 22nd of November of 1633, noting that it was St. Cecilia's Day, as the date of embarkation, and he indicates that the migrants, once they had crossed the channel, continued a southerly course along the western coast of Europe. The ark sailed as far south as Angola on the African west coast, where they took on supplies which included, quote, an abundance of salt and a number of goats, unquote. It is from there that the sloop proceeded to the West Indies, this latitude offering the shortest possible crossing of the high seas Atlantic for landing in the islands. This is precisely what the Pilgrims did shortly after the first of the year, 1634. If there was one sight more remarkable to them than the beaches of Barbados after 6 weeks of ocean travel, it may have been that of the Dove, of which Father White writes, quote, she overtook us at a large harbor in the Antilles, unquote. Reuniting with loved ones and associates whom they had memorialized nearly 2 months earlier must have provided an energizing boost. The journal provides the 24th of January of 1634 as the date on which the two boats departed Barbados, and with brief stops at other islands in the Caribbean, moved northward along the American East Coast. Although Father White wrote and surely preached and counseled about trust and the providence of God, he says they were, quote, full of apprehension as they reached Port Comfort, unquote, which looks onto the beginning of the Chesapeake Bay, one of the busiest points of land and sea travel in America then and today. His journal entry is 27th of February, 1634. After 4 days, they continued into the bay, maintaining the west shoreline as they moved toward the Potomac River. They named their landing spot St. Clement's Island, and on the 25th of March, which the Christian tradition holds as the date on which Mary of Nazareth accepted the call to become the mother of Christ, they celebrated Mass for the first time in what would become New England. The next 2 days, and likely all days thereafter, were busy ones. The civil leader of the group, one Leonard Calvert, aboard the Dove, sailed on further north, and at a location across the Potomac from what would become Mount Vernon, Virginia, he negotiated a peace pact with the chief Payak of the Piscataway tribe. In the meantime, other elements of the leadership explored the peninsula formed by the Potomac and the Patuxent rivers, and laid out the plan of a city on a smaller river called St. Mary, which became the colonial capital of the larger colony known as Maryland. It was named after Henrietta Maria, the wife of King Charles I, who had granted the charter for the colony. As I mentioned before I started reading, in the office at Cecilia in central Kentucky, from which I administer 3 Roman Catholic churches, and the home which provides a residence for me as their priest, I have a series of artistically framed prints of these 2 17th century sailing vessels, the Ark and the Dove. 2 of them are in the office, 2 similar ones are in the rectory. Some of their significance is apparent from the details that I've already presented. There will be more. Much of who I am, the life I have been living, and the threads and themes which emerge as I write this memoir will reveal their roots in the development of this pre-colonial migration and its aftermath. so I must examine more. Leonard Calvert, listed above as the civil leader of the Catholic colonists from the Ark and the Dove, headed the mission inspired and financed by his older brother, Cecilius Calvert, and their father, George. George's parents, Leonard and Alicia Crossland Calvert, were people of means who raised their son on an estate at Kipling in Yorkshire. They were closet Catholics. Raising their son in the waning 20 years of the reign of Elizabeth I, they received no less than 14 summonses and fines for nonconformity to the Church of England. Having been tutored at Kipling, young George attended Trinity College, Oxford, from which he graduated in 1597. His father, who had received an appointment to local office in the last year of Elizabeth's reign, saw to it that George would become clerk to Sir Robert Cecil. George served well, and in the court of King James I was appointed clerk of the Privy Council, was knighted, and in 1619 became principal Secretary of State. The king rewarded his service by making him Baron with the title Lord Baltimore. The title would pass to his sons, the first of whom was named for George's former boss, Sir Robert Cecil, whose own pedigree was quite stellar. He was the son of William Cecil, also known as Baron Lord Burleigh, who served as chief advisor to Queen Elizabeth for most of her long reign in the roles of Lord High Treasurer and Secretary of State. For his part, George Calvert, who in 1624 publicly declared his affinity with Catholicism, began to turn his talent, energy, fortune, and sons to the establishment of a colony in the New World. He received a royal land charter, and for most of the second decade of the 17th century, tried to establish a colony in Newfoundland. Reflecting his disappointment in a letter to the king dated the 19th of August of 1629, he indicates that on his way home to England, he will visit, quote, His Majesty's Dominion, Virginia. George would die less than 3 years after sending that letter, but King Charles I, who had succeeded James, honored the promise of a new charter. Cecilius Calvert and his younger brothers energetically recruited investors as well as pilgrims for the trip to the Chesapeake Bay. He devised and published 5 Conditions of Plantation, which spelled out in detail the offer of plots of land in the colony and the opportunities and responsibilities which came with ownership. He presented them with a letter of instruction containing a detailed course of action to be followed by colonists in no less than 15 specific situations. Most notably, these Catholics were advised to worship in private so as not to offend Protestant colonists. They were also directed to establish good diplomatic relations with the Virginia colony, but to deal with their leader, William Claiborne, with, quote, firmness and justice, unquote. This Claiborne had been in conflict with George Calvert during his trip to Virginia. Leonard Calvert carried out his older brother's plans, and by all accounts served ably as Maryland's first governor until his death in 1647. He was assisted by the priests who had accompanied him to the colony, and also by 2 women, one of whom would be called America's first suffragette, Father Andrew White, who had known the Calvert family in England, was one of 4 Jesuit companions on the Ark of the Dove. By 1639, they were joined by 3 others. White quickly learned the language of the native population and is credited with writing a dictionary for them and the colonists. In 1638, 2 single women, Margaret and Mary Brent, immigrated to the colony, bringing with them 9 other migrants who, according to the, quote, conditions of plantations, unquote, entitled them to possess considerable acreage. Mary became wife to Governor Calvert, and Margaret, who had extensive knowledge of law, became his very capable deputy. After one particularly bold decision made by Margaret, the Colonial Assembly declared in a letter to the governor that, quote, the colony's safety was better in her hands than any man else in the whole province, unquote. However, when in 1648 she petitioned as a landholder and an attorney for 2 votes in that lawmaking group, she was denied even 1. Still, she is remembered as a talented and remarkable woman, and she will be followed by many others in Maryland, in Kentucky, and in this memoir. What is it then that prompts these colonial Catholics to come to Kentucky? Well, of course, they don't come for about another century and a half, a period which sees them experience significant ups and downs in their great quest for a prosperous life of religious toleration. The immigrants across the river in Virginia, remember William Claiborne, were very much opposed to the royal charter being granted to the Maryland colony. In 1644, a group of Virginians in a ship named the Reformation attacked the colonial capital at St. Mary's City, causing Governor Calvert and others to flee for their lives. They burned houses and chapels throughout the city and captured one of the priests, taking him back to England to stand trial. These attacks continued for over 2 years and became known to history as the Claiborne Rebellion. After the governor's authority was restored, there was a period of relative peace in which Maryland adopted an Act of Toleration, guaranteeing religious freedom to all. In the meantime, Virginia passed laws declaring the Church of England as the only religious establishment in the colony. English Puritans who had migrated to Virginia were welcomed into Maryland. However, in time, they took control of the government, declared both Catholicism and Anglicanism illegal, making members of those churches ineligible to hold public office. Churches were destroyed and many colonists fled. Of course, life in the colonies reflected life in England. So when a Catholic monarch such as James II or his fellow Stuarts were on the throne, things went well for Catholics in the colony. When others, such as William and Mary, Oliver Cromwell, or the Georges were in power, things went well for Protestants. The 18th century saw the enforcement of penal laws in the colonies as well as the official establishment of the Church of England. Catholics and all others were forced to support the church with taxes. In addition, Catholics were forbidden from holding public office, practicing law, and to some extent, owning land. Public worship was forbidden. Catholicism could not be taught to children by priests or even by parents. The nearly 90 years of these conditions, topped off by British raids leading up to the War for Independence, prompted many Marylanders to look for another place to live. They began to look west. However, they could not allow themselves to be distracted by thoughts and plans for moving, because the war for independence from Britain and its effects would occupy them in Maryland for fully 10 years. As with most, if not all, the colonies, St. Mary's County, Maryland formed a militia and provided a defense against attacks from land and sea long before the 4th of July of 1776. During a colonial convention in the summer of 1775, St. Mary's County formed 2 companies of minutemen. Combined with similar groups from 2 other counties, they formed a battalion of regulars. In addition, a mobile reserve unit known as the Flying Camp was formed with similar organizations from Pennsylvania and Delaware. Positioned as they were between the Potomac and Patuxent rivers, with the Chesapeake Bay providing full access to the Atlantic, the Marylanders would have a significant role in the war. Remember how close they were to Mount Vernon? Maryland troops were with General Washington at major battles in the north, such as Wilmington, Germantown, Princeton, and Brandywine. After the Delaware River crossing and the terrible winter at Valley Forge, the poorly equipped Continental Army was resupplied with resources from St. Mary's County in Maryland. Their rivers and bays provided thousands of barrels of salt fish. The Maryland soldiers and sailors participated in the southern campaigns as well, specifically at Cowpens and Camden in the Carolinas. In September of 1781, 2 sloops and a schooner were sent from St. Mary's County, and Maryland volunteers were present the next month when the British surrendered at Yorktown. Hostilities did not end, however, with the surrender. British raiding continued to harass the residents of the new state of Maryland, particularly along the rivers. It is important to remember, too, that British loyalists remained throughout New England. Too often we think that the residents of the colonies were completely united in their fight for independence. There were problems with neighbors as well as with redcoats. The families of St. Mary's County were quite decimated, with casualty estimates in excess of 400 men. Farms and homes were also in a state of devastation from either neglect or direct destruction from acts of war. Survivors resumed looking west. It was in the west that yet another Jesuit priest, Jacques Marquette, had, with explorer Louis Joliet, become the first non-natives to explore and map the Mississippi River. Their fellow Frenchman, Robert de La Salle, had explored the Great Lakes and would also travel the Mississippi. French fur traders followed within 50 years, and population centers such as Vincennes on the Wabash River in the Indiana Territory were established as early as 1732. The Ohio River, explored by La Salle, would convey travelers west once they came through the central Appalachian Mountains of western Maryland and Pennsylvania. In 1750, another explorer, who was also a physician, Dr. Thomas Walker, discovered a passage through the southern part of the range, which he named after the son of King George II, the Cumberland Gap. Then about a quarter of a century later, Daniel Boone led migrants through the mountains to settle in an area not far from the present-day capital city of Kentucky. Reports and dispatches from these and other explorers made their way back to the 13 colonies. Oops, states. We can understand the Marylanders and the Virginians' reasons for looking west. But before examining their travel plans, we should give further consideration to who they were. Yes, we have studied them collectively as English slant American Catholics, Protestants and Puritans too. But these are the ancestors of myriads of people who live today in Maryland, Kentucky, and many other places. After nearly half a millennium, though much of their ethos, their mores, their values, their lifestyles have changed, much has remained. And their names are still with us. Did you notice the name of the town which I now call home, from which I'm reading this memoir? Cecilia. Other than a list of 17, quote, gentlemen, unquote, who arrived aboard the Ark in 1634, there is no complete manifest or passenger list for that first voyage. Historians even disagree regarding the number of those first immigrants, ranging from a low of 128 to a high of 300. Does that include women, children, servants, crew members? One of the earliest lists, cobbled together from various sources in the early days of the settlement, includes one William Brown and several Thompsons, another name which will have significance in my family history. Attached to the landmark Act concerning religion, referred to earlier as the Act of Toleration, which Governor Calvert proposed in 1648 and which provoked the ire of Oliver Cromwell and his long parliament in London, we find the name Walter Peake, who could be the ancestor of my paternal grandmother, Josephine Peake. As life in the colony developed further through the 17th century, other listings of names were published, and they provide sources for genealogists today. From such lists in the early 1700s, I find, somewhat to my surprise, names which are part of my mother's ancestry. John, Thomas, and Zechariah Bond. They are present too on the list of military men who muster at the time of the War for Independence. Athanasius Ford, also part of the Bond clan, is listed as a participant in a colonial assembly in 1774. Names such as Fenwick, Elder, Miles, Medley, Reynolds, again Thompson, and Spalding, which will be seen among the leadership of the Catholic Church in the Midwest throughout its first 200 years, are found in these records of colonial Maryland. The churches, too, established, destroyed, and reestablished throughout southern Maryland, will become resurrected and transplanted in Kentucky soil. St. Inigo's, the Basque name for Ignatius, was and still exists as the first parish established in the Maryland colony. Ignatius of Loyola, a Basque soldier turned priest, had founded the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, as a missionary order exactly 100 years before his successor, Andrew White, sailed with the Ark and the Dove. Father White, at that landfall mass on the Feast of the Annunciation in 1634, called the place St. Clement's Island after one of the martyred popes, whose calendar date of 23rd of November was the day on which the Ark, mourning the presumed loss of the Dove, was fully underway from the Isle of Wight in the English Channel. These, Ignatius and Clement, are but two of the many names which link Kentucky parishes to those of Maryland. Before looking at the actual departure of Maryland Catholics for Kentucky, and considering those members of my family who made the move, we should consider one more family name, whose prominence would be comparable to that of Cecil or Calvert. This is Carroll. And though none of the three we will mention here is known to have ever come to Kentucky, each would have influence here. Charles Carroll III, also called Charles Carroll of Carrollton, was an early advocate of separation from Great Britain and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His cousin Daniel was a delegate from Maryland to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, which wrote the Constitution, and he served in the first U.S. House of Representatives. Daniel's older brother John was yet another Jesuit priest who served the Catholic communities of St. Mary's County, Maryland. Although he would not move to Kentucky with them, he would bless their decision and would continue to give them great assistance with their lives of faith on the new frontier. Reference has already been made to the travels of Dr. Thomas Walker and Daniel Boone. Among their contemporaries were James Herod, Richard Henderson, and a priest of the Church of England, Reverend John Lyne. At Harrodsburg, on the 28th of May of 1775, under the arms of an elm tree whose canopy was said to have measured 400 feet in diameter, Lyne conducted the first public worship service held in the territory which would become Kentucky. It was a county of Virginia, which of course was still not a state. Prayers were prayed for, quote, England's most gracious sovereign Lord King George, unquote. More Virginia Protestants would come, led by Squire Boone, Daniel's brother, and the Craig brothers, including Elijah. In 1781, they were part of a caravan numbering several hundred, known as the Traveling Church, which would settle at places such as Cedar Creek in what would become Nelson County, and Severns Valley near the present community of Elizabethtown. Presbyterians from the Carolinas came in 1783 under the leadership of David Rice, a Virginian who developed congregations at Keene Run near Harrodsburg and at Danville, where they would develop a college. Followers of John Wesley, the Oxford student whose break from the Church of England would develop into Methodism, inspired Francis Asbury and Francis Clark to lead their faithful to Kentucky, also beginning in 1783. These would be the dominant faith groups in Kentucky in the last quarter of the 18th century. The Disciples of Christ joined the list in the first quarter of the 19th century. Other groups, including the Shakers, the Jews, and even Latter-day Saints, would come to Kentucky in its first half-century, but I highlight here the groups which will touch my life in a personal way and which will appear in later segments of this memoir. But what of those Maryland Catholics? You may wonder, patient reader, if I would ever tell of their departure from Maryland. They wondered about that too. As early as 1685, the year of the death of Charles II, the Catholics of Maryland seriously deliberated on a move. We have seen that they had reason to. In the 1750s, there was a proposal for seeking a grant from Catholic King Louis XV for land owned by France on the Arkansas River. The next decade brought a discussion of immigrating to the Spanish-held lands of Louisiana. It was in the 1780s, though, when, as we have seen, other faith groups began to make the move. Some serious factors on the frontier itself prevented their specific move to Kentucky. One, after the French and Indian War, the land was English, and George III prohibit settlement. 2, the land needed exploration and mapping, and this was done by the trailblazers mentioned above, as well as by Simon Kenton, Thomas Bullitt, and John Filson. And 3, settlement had to be made with the Native American peoples, and that happened with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, completed at Rome, New York, in which the Iroquois and the Shawnee nations relinquished claims to lands south of the Ohio River. This was in 1768. This agreement notwithstanding, George Rogers Clark, under orders from Virginia Governor Patrick Henry, would set up a military fort on Corn Island at the Falls of the Ohio in May of 1778. Its necessity would continue to become apparent. Following Walker's Cumberland Gap and Boone's Wilderness Trail, Christopher Durbin, his son Edwin, and his wife Betty Porter came into what would become Madison County and settled near the present-day cities of Berea and Richmond as early as 1779. Among Boone's 1774 group was Kentucky's first school teacher, Jane Coombs, who with her husband William settled in Harrodsburg, and the physician, Dr. William Hart, who settled near Bardstown. Other individual Catholics from this time of trickle could be cited, but the real flow came by river beginning in 1785. That was the year in which 60 families formed a league in Maryland, mostly in St. Mary's County, but also in Charles and Prince George counties. They pledged to immigrate to Kentucky within a specific period of time as circumstances would permit. They purchased land patents from the governments of Virginia as well as Maryland, and thus had specific destinations. Once the flow of immigrants started, it would continue well beyond the original League of 60, but for our purposes, the description will limit itself to the first 3 waves. Similarly, there will be many names available to us from the early records, scant though they sometimes are, but we will attempt to limit our listing to those who, as indicated above, will have particular influence on this memoir. It is important to note, too, that one family name may have a variety of spellings. Basil Hayden was the leader of the first group of 25 families who left Maryland in the spring of 1785. He was apparently assisted by one Philip Lee, to whom we are indebted for his capable record keeping. In his list, we find a Jeremiah Brown and a Francis Peake, along with a Spalding, a Mills, a Bowles, and an Evelyn, all of whom appear in the charts of my father's family. In addition, there is a Bond, a Johnson, and a Birch, who appear on my mother's side. Hayden also brings Clarks, Hagans, Budds, Boones, Bryans, and many other family names which will factor in civil as well as ecclesiastical history in Kentucky and beyond. This is an homage to the writer in whose debt all local genealogists and historians find themselves, the Honorable Benedict Flagey Webb. Webb's Centenary of Catholicity in Kentucky, 1884, along with Archbishop Martin John Spalding's Sketches of the Early Catholic Missions, 1844. I think I said 44 for Webb. Webb is 1884, Spaulding's book is 1844. And these are perhaps the closest published material we have which can be considered primary source. Webb's enormous and very detailed study intentionally limits his dealing with the Mattingly family because he writes, quote, "They are simply too prolific." The second group of families to come from the Maryland League arrived the next year under the leadership of the brothers Edward and Charles Bevan. A list similar in volume and content to that of Philip Lee, 1785, contains some of the same names, including another Brown, George, some Thompsons, and of course, more Mattingly. Other frequently found names in this group include Hardesty, Lancaster, Alvey, and Howard. Perhaps of most significance for this study, although it will require a bit of redaction, is the name Cecil, which belonged to four brothers, Matthew, Sylvester, Zechariah, and Jeremiah, all of whom lived to be old men, respected by their contemporaries and revered by their progeny. It was two of Matthew's grandsons who, with the support of the Kentucky legislature, changed the name to what I believe is the original spelling, C-E-C-I-L. It was in this name that the family established the Cecilian College in the town where I now live. Philip Miles and Thomas Hill led the group which came down the Ohio River in 1787, but they were delayed by nearly a year in reaching their planned destination. Near the point where the previous groups had left the river to travel overland, they were fired on by Indians along the shoreline. A servant in Thomas Hill's family was killed, as were all the horses on the flatboat. Hill was seriously wounded in both thighs. The river current took the group out of gun range, and by nightfall they had reached the protection of the fort at Corn Island near Louisville. From there, this group went to Bardstown, where they remained for most of the year, even though it was not their original destination. New names in this group would include Osborne, Wheatley, Jenkins, Jarboe, Buckman, Blandford, and a rival to the Mattingleys, Smith. Of course, of special interest to me is a family named Riney, whose 7 brothers included Christian Zechariah Riney. Born in 1763, he would live to be 96 years old. He was also the father of my great-great-great-grandmother on the Brown Peak side. He gave his name to the town nearest where my father was born. And it is well documented that he was Abraham Lincoln's first teacher. America's 16th president is said to have remembered Riney all his life. One of the most famous sayings attributed to Lincoln is this one about deception. Quote, "You can fool all of the people some of the time, and some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time," unquote. I would like to similarly suggest that all readers of this memoir will recognize some of the names I have thus far presented, and some of the readers will recognize all of the names, and many readers will find them on their own genealogical charts. What prompts me to recall, which prompts me to recall a story which I've enjoyed telling for years now. 3 archbishops of Louisville have served as my direct superior in the time that I have been in ordained ministry, now approaching 46 years. Each of the last 2, the late Thomas C. Kelly and currently serving Joseph E. Kurtz have shared a version of this story. On the occasion when Archbishop Kurtz formally installed me in my current position of priest administrator here in Hardin County, Don Waters, attending the Mass, said, quote, "Archbishop, did you know Father Brown and I are related?" Unquote. The Archbishop immediately said, "That's nice, Don, but I was hoping to meet someone who wasn't." Thomas Kelly, who was from New York, had a great affection for the Bluegrass State. Some of his undergraduate education and formal spiritual training took place here in the 1950s. And by all accounts, he was thrilled to receive the appointment from St. Pope John Paul II in 1982 to be Archbishop here. He listed, though, among what he considered as collective characteristics, which were in his experience peculiar to Kentuckians, the fact that we are so knowledgeable of our extended family. He once said to me, "Ben, I don't even know if I have a second cousin." So his comment from this story is understandable and always produces a laugh when I tell it. It seems that a person approached him once and with a bit of swagger said, "Archbishop, I am a cousin to Father Ben Brown." And I'm told that Kelly's response was, "Big deal, so is everybody else in the Archdiocese." Having made only vague reference to the destinations for these first waves of settlers from Maryland and the area around the Chesapeake Bay, it is important now to look at those specific locations in central Kentucky. It goes without saying that there were exceptions within a group, even within the first generation. However, there can be no doubt that the groups had specific destinations in mind, and they are forever associated with those places. Their descendants are there to this day. It will be no surprise either that they settled along streams, which provided not only hydration and food for crops, livestock, and homes, but also avenues of travel. The streams, forks, creeks, and branches, which we will highlight, will form a network feeding into bigger rivers, some of which have already been mentioned and whose importance all over frontier America is a given. One question which should be addressed, at least briefly here, is why these early settlers moved inland to establish themselves instead of making their homes initially near Colonel Clark's fort at what would become the metropolitan area of Louisville. A major reason was that even though the founding date for the city of Louisville was 1778, it would be nearly a half century before it was really habitable or even well suited to commerce. The falls of the Ohio limited river traffic, and the large amount of standing water and shallow ponds made disease-bearing insects a terrible problem. Devastating epidemics of cholera and malaria would be the norm in the 19th century. The group with Basil Hayden and Philip Lee came ultimately to a location known as Pottinger's Creek, a tributary of the Beech Fork River in Nelson County, which would become one of the 4 original counties 7 years later as Kentucky achieved its status as the 15th state. Today there is a plaque marking this location, a short walk from the Trappist Abbey of Gethsemane, whose own beginnings will be considered later in this chapter. It is, however, in the village of Holy Cross that a similar marker commemorates the first wave of the League of 60. These markers are part of an official system established and maintained by the State Department of Highways and Transportation. These people came, as would many thereafter, overland to Pittsburgh, and from there down the Ohio to a landing they called Limestone near the northern Kentucky city of Maysville. Goodwin Station, near the present village of Boston in Nelson County, was a fortified post. Leaving the women and children under the protection of the fort, the able-bodied men and boys traveled the further 13 miles and set about the task of clearing land and setting up temporary shelters. Basil Hayden, whose name will come up in these pages in at least one more context, donated a parcel of land for the specific purpose of building a church. The building, which stands on the site today, dates from 1823, and however, Holy Cross is recognized as the oldest parish in the Midwest. In 1985, at a celebration of the bicentennial, I said to the above-mentioned Archbishop Kelly, they did not have a priest in 1785. He taught me an important lesson when he said, Ben, the priest is not what is essential to a parish. The 1786 group followed the previous year's routing through western Maryland and southern Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh, on downriver to the Limestone Landing and overland to then Nelson County. No doubt they were welcomed warmly by the folks of Holy Cross, who surely joined them in prayers of thanksgiving. However, their settlement would begin about 10 miles further inland on Hardin's Creek, which flows into the Rolling Fork River. Their villages were also given religious names, including Calvary and Holy Mary's. They were located near Lebanon, the seat of Marion County today. The above-mentioned Mattingly and Sissel families from this group would make contributions to the settlement, but they would be amplified by subsequent arrivals. 2 years later, one John Lancaster would, while making the trip, be captured, tortured, scalped, be forced to watch companions murdered, and escape, living not only to tell the tale, but to become the father of 11 children who lived to adulthood and serve as a member for over 20 years of the Kentucky legislature. He lived to be 95 years old. The Lancaster family, along with the Spaldings, Abels, and subsequent arrivals to the settlement, such as the Hamiltons, would produce several members of the clergy and religious leadership, not only of the local community, but the national and international church as well. The area would also see the development of the first American-born community of women religious and a men's college, which would become a seminary and have a lifespan of well over 150 years. As we have seen, the 1787 group from the League were delayed in reaching their destination. They had also come via Pittsburgh down the river, but through Louisville and to Bardstown. They would settle, though, on Cartwright's Creek, a tributary of the Beech Fork River in what would soon become Washington County. The creek received its name from Samuel Cartwright, who with James and Jacob Sandusky had prospected through the district 10 years earlier. They built a stockade comparable to the one at Goodwin Station, which had been such a benefit to the 1785 settlers. Another important arrival prior to the 1787 group was General Matthew Walton, who, as a Virginian, had been awarded a land grant soon after the surrender at Yorktown. He would represent the Kentucky Territory in the Virginia legislature, as well as at the conventions in Danville, which would lead to statehood. The trail which the wounded Thomas Hill would use to come from Louisville to Bardstown and on to Cartwright's Creek was a new one. It had been blazed, literally, during Hill's recovery by another traveler named Edward Howard, who would have significance as a leader in his own right. However, among his companions in late 1787 was the first priest to have any extended stay in Kentucky. Reverend Paul St. Pierre, a Frenchman with German roots, had stopped briefly in Louisville in 1785. But Charles Maurice Whalen, an Irishman who had served as chaplain in the French fleet during the American Revolution, received a request from John Carroll in Maryland to come to Kentucky. After the war, Father Whalen had become pastor of St. Peter's, the First Catholic Church in New York City. However, he had limited skills as a preacher and was rather tactless, so accepted Carroll's encouragement to go to the frontier of Kentucky. As we will see, though, Father Whalen's would be a meager contribution to the ministry and life of Kentucky. That would not be the case for Edward Howard and other members of the 1787 wave of the League of 60. We're an hour into it, and about maybe, oh my gosh, maybe we are 6 more pages. What do you think, Karen? The folks that are listening can turn me off whenever they want to.
Go ahead.
She says, go ahead, everybody. Well, you all can turn me off when you want to. Remember that name, Edward Howard. Many of the sources of information about these 18th century migrations characterize the newly arrived pilgrims as disappointed with their sight-unseen land purchases. Bishop Spalding, whose 1844 sketches is the earliest published account remaining, writes, "The selection of Pottinger's Creek as the location of the new Catholic colony was unfortunate. The land was poor and the situation altogether uninviting." Unquote. As these reports went back east, the continuing flow of Marylanders, like water itself, naturally sought other locations. The routing from the limestone landing brought travelers through what today is called the Bluegrass region. They found the land very inviting along the Kentucky River and its tributaries. Fayette and Lincoln were 2 of the 4 original counties, but early settlers went to farms in the region that now include Fleming, Pendleton, Bracken, Woodford, Bourbon, Franklin, Anderson, Mercer, Boyle, and Scott counties. Some went as far south and west as Barron, Logan, and Christian counties, and as we have seen, Madison County in the east. The Bowling family, which would proliferate like some names we've already seen, settled in Jefferson County, another of the original 4. But as we have also seen, life was difficult there. Of these settlements, the one at White Sulphur in present-day Scott County would perhaps prove to be the most significant in the early days. At a place called White Sulphur, families such as the Goffs, the Greenwells, the Combs, the Deerings, and a widow, Mrs. Ann James, developed what would be the second parish in the Midwest. Mrs. James made her home available for the traveling priest to offer Mass, likely before 1790. Relatively quickly, the families numbered over 24, and they developed the parish of St. Francis, which, as with Holy Cross, still thrives today. 3 other early communities which survive on these early foundations of faith are those of Breckenridge, Meade, and Great. The Thompsons, Browns, and Peaks, along with Vessels, Vowels, Whalens, and Nevetts, would settle there. However, their flows could only get strong after the turn of the 19th century, when passage around the falls of the Ohio could be engineered and navigated. One of the qualities often listed when reading and writing about these migratory pioneers is resiliency. Perhaps it applies well to this issue of the land being, quote, poor and uninviting. Well, it was apparently not too poor to grow barley, wheat, rye, and corn. And those streams, branches, and springs, flowing as they did through a terrain of limestone, produced water which would prove refreshing in more ways than one. From the earliest days, these skillful settlers developed the distilling process which would produce what for generations and throughout the civilized world is acknowledged as fine Kentucky bourbon. Of the myriad of brands and labels available today, I would offer 3 with connections to this memoir. We have learned about a Catholic leader named Basil Hayden and a Baptist leader named Elijah Craig. Their names are both on best-selling bottles today. As a result of the migrations we have studied here, Kentucky became separated from Virginia, was given the title Commonwealth, and joined the Union as the 15th state on the 1st of June, 1792. One of the most popular products marketed from the Barton Distillery in Nelson County is labeled 1792. A memoir of a Kentucky priest would surely be an appropriate place to tell some stories involving spirits. In a subsequent chapter, I will describe ministry in many locations and contexts, but here is one from the tour of duty which I served at a Veterans Administration hospital in southwestern Ohio. Since I was living in central Kentucky and it was a long commute, I requested and received hospitality from a household priest in Centerville, Ohio. Invited to their bar, I asked if they knew that invited to their bar, I asked what brand of bourbon they might have, to which they replied, Elijah Craig. When I asked if they knew that Craig had pastored a group of Baptists on their journey to the Kentucky frontier, they said, "We don't know his name from anywhere but this bottle." When I asked if they knew who Basil Hayden was, the answer was, "Never heard of him." I gave them a much abbreviated version of the history that you have endured here, and the response was something like, "Okay." When I parted company with the priest after about 3 weeks, I left them a token of my gratitude in the form of 2 bottles, Elijah Craig and Basil Hayden. The note read, "Thanks, fellas, and now you're barred as a Baptist and a Catholic." And since I've written this about a year or so ago, I've discovered that not only is there 1792, but there's a bottle called 1783, which of course is when the Baptists arrived in Kentucky. Another story. Then there was the time that I attended a scholarly presentation in the auditorium of the fine library and archive center in Louisville known as the Filson Club. It is named in memory of the cartographer we learned about from the early days of Kentucky settlement, John Filson. I have great appreciation for this wonderful resource. The presentation which I was attending consisted of a team of highly credentialed scholars who had studied some primary source material in the form of handwritten diaries from pioneers who traveled not to, but away from Kentucky, going further west after the discoveries of Lewis. It was fascinating information and well presented. However, I was surprised and more than a bit chagrined at the scholars' slow response to a question following the lecture. They did not know how to respond to when did Kentucky become a state. Sitting near the back of the auditorium, I lowered my head and I projected my voice as I said, "You can find out in any good liquor store." We have read a sampling of the names which the early Catholic migrants gave to their communities. Holy Cross, Calvary, Holy Mary's would be followed by many others, commemorating saints or places important in the Bible. Certainly, this was the practice with other faith groups as well. But a memorable moment occurred in a very public setting in February of 1982. Thomas C. Kelly, already mentioned here, about whom more will be written, was being installed as Archbishop in a very formal ceremony in Louisville. Thousands were in attendance, including the Pope's representative, the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, hundreds of other clergy from around the country and region, and of course the faithful of the Archdiocese, descendants for generations of the pioneers from Maryland and many other places. Expressing at length his gratitude and joy about coming to serve in Kentucky, Archbishop Kelly spoke and later write that the map of Kentucky reads like more like a prayer book than a gazetteer. Referring to streets in Louisville, he listed St. Anthony Place, St. Catherine, St. Cecilia, St. Louis, St. Michael, St. Xavier, and others. Turning to the area of the early settlements, he noted Calvary, Holy Cross, Gethsemane, Loretto, Nazareth, New Hope. Then with his characteristic Irish twinkle and the impeccable comic timing which we would come to love, he said, "Why, there is even a Heaven Hill." Very popular brand of the Bourbon distillery. Archbishop Kelly had generations of predecessors in his role as an ecclesiastical superior in the United States, but the first one was an English Jesuit who we have already noted was a member of the patriotic family which shared the national stage with Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and others of the founding fathers, John Carroll. Until 1789, the colonies, later states, were under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of French Canada. Remember Marquette and Joliet? And later the Vicar Apostolic of London. Andrew White and the other Jesuits through the decades in Maryland received their authority from the Pope, but through his vicars. However, as patriots, they fully espoused the principles of the Revolution, especially independence and democracy. So then, after the war was over and nationhood had begun, the Marylanders began to think about the establishment of a bishopric or a diocese for America. Pope Pius VI, responding to their desires, was poised to appoint a bishop in the usual way, from on high. However, the Americans wanted input. The Vatican invited them to submit 3 names, a practice which is much more standard today. They submitted John Carroll, and John Carroll. The Pope made the appointment on the 6th of November of 1789. Instead of going to Rome for ordination, Carroll went to the small family chapel in Lulworth Castle along the coast of Dorset in England, and there was ordained by Bishop Charles Walmsley. Returning to America, he took up his post as its first Catholic bishop at Baltimore. To put his responsibilities in a mathematical formula, he had 25 priests to serve 25,000 Catholics, covering all the territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. Knowing he would need a source closer to home, he recruited a particular group known as the Society of St. Sulpice, whose specialty was the training of priests. By 1791, they had established a seminary. In 1789, Carroll's Jesuits had established Georgetown University in the District of Columbia. That year, of course, also saw the beginning of government by the U.S. Constitution on the 4th of March, and 8 weeks later, the inauguration of George Washington as its first president. Meanwhile, out in Kentucky, Edward Howard, in whose company Father Charles Whalen had traveled to the frontier, had settled on land just south of Bardstown. He was already a mature man with a grown son, Thomas, when he homesteaded about 400 acres, which would be inherited by Thomas and his wife, Anne Goff. Within about 20 years, that location would be donated for religious purposes and would surpass other earlier locations to earn the title Birthplace of Catholicism in the Midwest. It will have a similarly prominent place in this memoir and in the life of its author. That is the end of part one of 1633 to 1947. And we're just barely up to about 1800. Let me see. That was a 75-minute reading of 22 pages. So, Karen, I'll let you know how long the next section is. As I said before, people can turn me off. You can't. So we'll decide how long you want to go. All right, thanks everybody. I hope it wasn't too tedious. Turn it off and on and go get you another cup or glass of something that you might like to have while you're listening. That's all for today. We'll be back tomorrow.